Hello, welcome to the Frequent Flyer Levy webinar. Good morning, afternoon, good evening. Good evening, for those like Larry in Alaska at midnight. We're going to be talking about the Frequent Flyer Levy for about an hour and a quarter. We'll have some presentations, some information, and then some discussion. Without further ado, let's press on with Ali, who's going to tell us what on earth the Frequent Flyer Levy is.
Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that showing up okay? Fantastic. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about what the Frequent Flyer Levy is and why we think that it's needed as one of the measures to tackle aviation emissions. Then I'm going to think a little bit about how we can actually talk about fare demand reduction now while levels of flying are at record lows due to the pandemic. So what I'm going to talk about is quite focused on the UK in terms of the policy situation, because that's what we've researched. But we think that similar patterns in terms of the inequality around who's flying are found in other countries. And during the webinar, we are going to widen the discussion to talk about these issues globally rather than just in the UK. So what is the Frequent Flyer Levy? It's a fair way to reduce demand for air travel. It's basically a policy proposal for a progressive tax that would increase per flight that each person takes in a given time period. So somebody would pay low tax or no tax on their first flight, and then there'd be a higher rate of tax for each subsequent flight. So why do we need to reduce demand for flights to tackle aviation emissions? So everyone here probably already knows the statistic that aviation makes up just a couple of % of global carbon dioxide emissions, but it also makes up about at least 6% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's only going to get bigger towards 2050 as other sectors decarbonize and if we don't constrain demand for flights. Technology improvements are essential, but even if we're really optimistic, these just aren't going to be enough on their own to fix the problem and allow levels of flying to continue. We also can't achieve the emissions reductions that we need if demand for flights is allowed to just keep on growing. So in the UK government official advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, have suggested that growth in air travel can only be 25%. And they're due to release updated projections in December, which we hope will be a bit more ambitious around the prospect for demand reduction. But the UK government thinks that if there aren't measures put in place to limit demand, it will grow by 50% to 2050. So that's a huge increase in levels of flying. So this is from the UK's carbon budget projections to 2050. So as you can see, aviation is expected to take up about a third of the UK's residual greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But this only works by relying on a huge amount of negative emissions being possible by then. So as you can see, the committee is expecting that we'll have a huge amount of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And as you can see in the dotted section, there's also more removals needed, which they haven't figured out yet how we're going to achieve. So I expect everyone here is aware that bioenergy and bioenergy to use for carbon capture and storage is really, really problematic. Quite apart from the fact that it's not really something that's existing at the moment, it's also potentially going to raise huge issues around inequalities and land rights and land grabs. So allowing aviation to take up such a huge amount of our carbon budget with no real path to removing those emissions is really, really, really problematic. I think there's also a moral hazard of assuming that it's fine to keep polluting because at some point some technologies might come along that will mean we can tackle it, rather than being like, well, actually, okay, let's not pollute. So access to flying is really, really unequal. This is the statistic for the UK, where you can see that just 15% of people in the UK are taking 70% of all flights. And around 50% of people in the UK don't fly at all in any given year. And as you'd expect, access to aviation is heavily skewed towards people at the higher end of the income distribution spectrum. And this is in the UK, which itself is a wealthy country with high levels of flying. And as you would expect, globally, the situation is even more unequal. People might have seen the recent paper that finding that just 1% of people globally are responsible for 50% of the emissions from flying. So people around the world who are the poorest are suffering first and hardest from the impacts of the climate crisis, but the benefits of very high carbon services like aviation are enjoyed only really by a minority of wealthy people. So there are a number of policy options for managing demand for air travel. And we think we're going to need a combination of these measures to tackle this. So there's taxing fuel, there's bringing flights into VAT, there's carbon pricing, there's putting a flat tax on air passengers, restricting airport capacity, and also what we're proposing, which is the frequent flyer levy. And we think we're going to need, a combination of measures, that one measure alone isn't going to be enough to tackle this, but that a measure like the frequent flyer levy, which is progressive, is going to need to be included as part of the mix. People have become used to cheap flights. At the moment, international aviation emissions are usually not included in countries' carbon budgets. And because it's international, ideally there would be international measures to address this rather than relying only on national policy measures. But whatever happens, if we want to reduce demand, flying is likely to need to become more expensive. And the history of aviation is that generous tax breaks have kept the cost of flying artificially low relative to other travel options. So we published research over the summer which found that pre-COVID, the UK taxpayer was handing aviation a tax break worth 7 billion per year by exemptions from VAT and fuel duty. So if people are buying petrol at the pump to get to work, they'll pay fuel tax, but not people flying on holiday. And you'll pay VAT, value-added tax, on things like bicycles and sanitary products, but not on plane tickets. Fuel duty. So historically, jet fuel has been untaxed, dating back to a convention put in place towards the end of the Second World War, which was aiming to boost air travel. And this is kind of, often seen by governments as meaning that they absolutely can't tax jet fuel, but people have actually argued that if countries wanted to do this, then they could. And for comparison, if jet fuel was taxed at the same rate that the UK levies fuel duty on petrol at the pump, that would add around £40 to the cost of a return ticket from the UK to Barcelona, or about 200 to a flight to New York and back. So we're in favour of taxing jet fuel. Like, it's ridiculous that it's not taxed. But if this was brought in by itself and without also including a frequent flyer levy or air miles levy, this would be regressive, because it would reduce flying by poorer travellers who fly less often more than it would reduce flying by wealthier people who fly more often. So it would increase inequality rather than reducing it. Plane tickets are zero rated for VAT, and the other things that the UK zero rates for VAT are things like wheelchairs and baby clothes, so things that really are completely essential. The UK does charge air passenger duty on most airline tickets, but it's just £13 for a short haul flight and £78 for a long haul flight. And it doesn't go up it doesn't increase the more flights people take. Carbon pricing, so this is where businesses would pay for permits to emit carbon, and the price would be set so that the upper limit of emissions is capped. And flights within Europe come under the ETS, the emissions trading scheme. But at the moment, that's adding just £1 or £2 to the cost of a typical ticket. So this isn't enough to provide a disincentive to frequent flying or to be remotely proportionate to the amount of harm that's caused by flying. So in their projections on carbon pricing, the UK government is forecasting an escalating carbon price that will reach more than £200 per tonne by 2050. But even with this escalating carbon price, they still see that demand for flying will go up by 50% more by 2050. So even if we do get this carbon price, there's going to need to be additional measures to limit demand. But in fact, the government doesn't even have a plan to introduce this carbon price. So unless that comes in, it's likely that flying would increase by even more. So we think that a frequent flyer levy has to be included in the policy measures to reduce aviation emissions, to ensure that this is done fairly and that the people who are flying less because of the policy are the ones who are at the moment flying the most. And we don't think that, we're not saying the frequent flyer levy by itself is going to reduce aviation emissions by the amount required. We're also going to need a kerosene tax and a ban on aviation, on airport expansion. So it would increase, it would be a tax that went up per flight that somebody took within a 12-month period. And it would leave most people who fly, 0 or 1 times per year unaffected, or possibly even paying slightly lower taxes. And it would place the burden of paying higher taxes onto people who fly the most. So demand management through increased prices needs to reduce rather than increase inequality. And we think that this is essential to achieve public buy-in. To get public consent for reducing overall level of flights, it has to be done in a way that's fair and is seen to be fair. Meeting the net zero target means that some flights have to be stopped in the future, and the overall cost of flying has to go up. But without a frequent flyer levy or air miles levy, most of the reduction in flights would come from people on below average incomes who rarely fly, flying even less. Clearly that would be unfair, and it would increase inequality in a world that's already highly unequal. Using a frequent flyer levy instead would mean that most of the reduction came from people on above average incomes who fly often. And yeah, for the purposes of the research, we're defining a frequent flyer as somebody who flies 3 or more times per year. So that's the 15% of people in the statistic, the ones taking 70% of flights. Obviously, we're absolutely not saying that if you fly less than 3 times per year, that's a sustainable number of flights to take. So a frequent flyer levy could be a way to manage growth in demand for flights while maintaining access to some air travel for people across the income spectrum. Obviously, legislating for a frequent flyer levy is hard. Most politicians and other power holders are themselves within the minority of frequent flyers. In the UK, before the election, which we had at the end of last year, parties apart from the Conservatives, the ones who are now in power, supported bringing in a frequent flyer levy. Obviously, the situation now is even more complicated due to the impact of COVID. So how would the frequent flyer levy work in practice? Well, it would need to take into account the length and the class of flight, because they're both strongly correlated with the size of the emissions footprint. So ideally, we'd be looking at something structured along the lines of an air miles levy. And business and first class tickets both have a much higher carbon footprint than standard class. So we think it would be fair for those passengers to pay a higher tax. It would be introduced alongside other policy measures to limit demand for flights. So alongside taxing jet fuel, stopping airport expansion, ideally alongside a functional and properly funded rail system that meant that people could still travel. And ideally that would have a system where it was cheaper and just as easy for people to take a train rather than a plane for short haul flights. And it would also ideally be implemented globally or regionally, which is likely to be more effective than a national measure. So why are we talking about the frequent flyer levy and reducing aviation demand now, when the industry is completely crippled by the COVID crisis? Obviously this is difficult, and it's something that we've been thinking a lot about at the moment, especially as the UK has just gone into its second lockdown. But we think as well that right now people are really aware about the importance of protecting people working in the industry, and about the need to reduce our vulnerability to future crises. We think as well that at the moment there's a lot of public sympathy for airline workers. They've been treated really badly by the industry in the UK, and I think there's also been no public support at all for airline bosses who just display this total greed and lack of concern for their employees during this crisis. We've seen airlines accessing hundreds of millions in state-backed loans. They've taken funding from the furlough scheme, which is meant to protect jobs, and at the same time they've been trying to make up to a third of their workforces redundant. These are some headlines that we saw over the summer. Airlines, including British Airways, came in for a lot of criticism in Parliament, even from Conservative MPs who wouldn't usually be particularly pro trade unions. They were trying not only to make mass redundancies, but also to make use of the crisis to push their employees onto worse employment conditions and lower wages. There's also been some public concern about the role of air travel in spreading the virus. We did some polling which found that 3/4 of the UK public think that airlines were too slow to suspend flights when the pandemic hit. So again, that's another example of them putting their profits ahead of people's well-being. And I think that airlines' behaviour through this crisis has kind of made it clear to the public for the first time that airlines are not really good corporate citizens, and that their leadership has been really greedy and irresponsible. And reducing aviation demand is one of the essential measures that we need to take to cut emissions and tackle the climate crisis, which all the polling is still showing that people are still deeply concerned about, even as we're suffering from the impacts of COVID. But at the moment, we also don't know what the post-COVID new normal for our society is going to look like, and what kind of travel behaviours people are going to go back to. But we think that now is also a time that we need to make a really strong argument around building back better, prioritising the things that really matter. And that includes protecting people, protecting workers, and cutting emissions to build a stronger society and take action on the climate crisis. And we're also seeing at the moment what the economic and social impacts of an abrupt and unmanaged transition look like. And again, this is a really strong argument for the need to manage down high carbon sectors such as aviation in a way that's fair and equitable and provide social and environmental benefits. So in the UK, bringing in a progressive tax on aviation, which puts higher costs on people who fly more, is supported by the Citizens' Assembly on Climate, which is the body constituted by the UK government to represent the views of UK citizens on climate. And you can see here from this polling that a majority agree with having a progressive tax on aviation, which puts that means that people pay higher taxes as they fly more and as they fly further. The Committee on Climate Change, who are the UK government's official advisors on carbon budget, also support bringing in a progressive tax. There's also support from other charities, including charities which have a mandate more broadly towards development rather than climate, such as Oxfam. And we've also done polling, which has found that there's public support for a frequent flyer levy as well. Clearly, all of these things so far have not been enough to actually get the policy change. But we think that there's potential for people to really support fair policies to build back better for aviation, with fair demand reduction, affordable train travel, and also measures to support people who are currently working in the sector who are losing their jobs. So it's definitely not simple or easy to argue for the frequent flyer levy at this time. But it's also clear that the current model for air travel isn't really working for anyone at the moment. And that as we recover from the COVID crisis, we can't just go back to business as usual.
Cool. Fantastic, thanks, Ali. That's a very thorough run through of the frequent flyer levy and some of the context. I'm just thinking we've actually only had one question coming from Wendy, so maybe we'll just take that while it might be still in her mind, and then I'll say some quick things. Wendy, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, I've got more than one question.
Great.
So when you talk about a flight, is that a return flight? Because some people may only sort of go one way to somewhere that they're going to stay for some while, like a job abroad or something. Would you envisage the levies being different between national and international and short and long haul? Because places like America, people fly within their country the whole time, but that's not so frequent in smaller countries. Do you think that a sliding cost of a levy would be enough to deter the very rich and businesses, given that, you know, they are very rich? Would you tax pilots and people? Because pilots, although they're not paying for a ticket when they're flying, they do tend to sort of dash back and forth between their flights, you know, all staff. And there'd also need to be a lot of education of the businesses that decided that they could manage. For example, my MP travels from Cumbria by train back and forth to Parliament, but you know, people with jobs like that, their workplaces have got to be made aware to make it easier for them to participate. And there was a period where travel was in lockdown, and my MP couldn't vote in Parliament. He couldn't vote, you know, online, as it were, even though he could join in debates. So there's a lot of that sort of education to go on if we're going to expect people to use conferencing instead of flying for business and government and things like that. And people who say, well, I have to fly because it's my job, like MEPs or that sort of thing. So there's a lot of questions to iron out. And I can see that, you know, you're going to be pushed to iron out all these kind of discrepancies. And that's why I think this is a real hard slog that you've got ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, so the modelling that we've done is UK based. So yeah, the UK is smaller than some other countries. So we're not proposing that domestic flights should be exempt. We think that in the UK, there's really very little need for domestic flights, and that they should basically be taken over by train journeys. For things like connectivity to islands, we think that's an ideal opportunity for electric planes, because they're relatively short journeys with relatively low number of passengers. And I think that would be an ideal opportunity for electric plane development and rollout, and the same for flights by private jets. That's not something that we think would be tackled by the Frequent Flyer Levy. We think that the rules around private jets should be that you can only fly your private jet into the UK if it's electric, on the basis that, you know, the group of people who can afford to pay to invest in a new and emerging technology has quite a high overlap with the kind of people who can afford to take flights by private jet. But yeah, you're right that domestic flights are more of an issue for people living in larger countries like America or Australia. But again, I think we'd say that, you know, our preference would be that the first choice for people's journeys is an efficient and affordable train network rather than a flight. Oh yeah, sorry, and business travel as well. Yeah, we think that business flights should be falling within the frequent flyer levy. At the moment, only around 1 in 10 flights in the UK is a business travel journey. It'll be really, really interesting to see what proportion that is as flying starts to happen again, and whether businesses are still doing that proportion of flights, or whether they're actually realizing that they save time and money by having, you know, functional video conferencing. And it'll be also interesting to see what impact that has on the aviation industry, because at the moment, although business flights are quite a small proportion of flights, they make up a larger proportion of the industry's profits. So that reduction in business flights could have a larger impact on the industry's profit margins. And in terms of taxing pilots within the frequent flyer levy, that's really interesting. I don't think we've considered that, but I think if that were to happen, that would be very punitive for the pilot if they're expected to be kind of personally liable for each flight, because pilots are going to be flying, you know, multiple times per week. If that was something that the aviation industry had to pay, then yeah, that would be interesting. I'm not sure what kind of strange knock-on effects that would have on employment patterns within the industry. That'd be quite interesting to take a look at.
Great, thanks, Ali. Actually, there's one other bit that Wendy asked us about whether the 3 flights are return flights or one-way flights.
So I think they're one-way flights, that we're modelling flights coming into or leaving the UK rather than a return journey. So yeah, I think you're right. That would be 1.5 return trips per year.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, I'm just going to carry on from all of that with just a quick look at inequality. If I can find it, here we go. Where are we? What am I showing? Can you guys see? Yeah, can you see that slideshow? Visible? Yeah. Where's the button? Here we go. Great. So I've just got a couple of a few things really. Given that given that the frequent flyer levy as a policy solution is rooted in trying to address carbon, but also the inequality in aviation, in flying, I think it's just useful not to lose sight of the sort of wider lens of inequality and keep that in mind. There's no suggestion really that the frequent flyer levy is a panacea for inequality across aviation. It will, you know, it could. It's proposed as a way to reduce inequality, but it's not going to solve all of it. So I just want to touch on a few issues around equality in aviation that will remain, that are still there, and that frankly need other solutions. Just so that we can kind of keep that in mind. So the first one, which Ali's alluded to, is the private jets. And just this week, we've seen yet more news coverage of the one area of the aviation industry which does not seem to be suffering at all with COVID, or at least suffering far less. Whilst aviation around the world is has broadly been about 80% reduced over the last 6 months. Something which we're going to get onto after this presentation and talk about. But private jets have had their demand much more steady. People spending 24,000 from the UK, so £24,000 for a flight for 5 people from the UK to the Canary Islands is the kind of thing that extremely wealthy people can afford to do and are still prepared to do. So, and clearly, as Ali mentioned, a frequent flyer levy is not going to hit people who are willing to book, or willing and able to book, private jets to escape, whatever it might be, whether they're trying to run away from a lockdown, as in this headline, or travel, or whatever it might be. But clearly, that's massively unfair, hugely kind of like a result of their privilege and wealth. And if we want to build more equal aviation, we need to address that. So things like a rule around these could be electrified more easily. There might be other solutions. Secondly, on airport locations, airports are by and large cause a huge amount of conflict in terms of where they're built, in terms of their that impact of land grabbing around buying or taking land to build them, and also the ongoing impacts around the air pollution, the noise pollution for local communities, and the traffic kind of to get for people traveling to the airport. Again, not something that the frequent flyer levy is going to tackle, and something that's going to remain even if we start building airports. Those ongoing impacts of existing airports tend to be on less well-off communities, tend to be in the UK, for instance, far more likely. If people of colour are much more likely to be sort of feeling sort of impacted by those air and noise pollution effects. So again, like something that we need to bear in mind. And then on a more global scale, there's people have probably seen this Oxfam graph of emissions, which is old, but it sort of makes the point quite clearly around broadly around emissions, but even more so for aviation. It's even more kind of as the sort of paradigm example of inequality and carbon inequality. That those who are flying are polluting hugely, polluting disproportionately, and those who are feeling the impacts of kind of climate breakdown are a long way, tend to be in a different place and tend to be not flying. So I think that broader pattern of who's flying beyond just the sort of national level is also something that needs wider kind of consideration. And finally, the solutions. So not only is the kind of status quo of aviation problematic, but all the solutions that the industry are suggesting, particularly things like biofuels, which would require a huge amount of oil crops, or sourcing of plant-based oils from somewhere. It's likely to require huge tracts of monoculture, as we was touched on in the webinar last night. And equally offsets, and the idea that we can kind of pollute in sort of one place, particularly in the global north, and plant trees or take some sort of mitigating action in broadly the global south and ask other people to cut emissions, is deeply kind of unfair and a very kind of carbon colonial approach. And finally, I think just the mindset of the industry. So not only is the status quo unequal, and something that even in the absence of climate breakdown is something that should be addressed in terms of access to travel and the rest of it. But the mindset of the industry in terms of the status quo of maintaining this inequality is fundamentally problematic. All the solutions that the industry come up with are broadly kind of do not seek to address this inequality. So I think that broadly that the frequent flyer levy has to be seen as a potential tool to target both. It would address carbon and inequality, but not holistically. It has to be seen as part of a raft of measures, a collection of tools in a toolbox that can help sort of address the wider problems of inequality around flying. Great, and that's it from me. And so now,
so Todd just had a question from the last one we didn't get around to. If you want to just touch on that one first.
Yeah, in fact Q&A is where we're headed. So let's start with Todd.
Thanks, Calum. Yeah, it was a question for Ali on the short haul effects of the frequent flyer levy. Like, how do you see the frequent flyer levy ensuring that rail is cheaper than short haul flights? Is there any way that you could look at if a destination was already served by rail, then there could be a penalty induced just because there was already that option? And yeah, just from like a pilot's perspective, currently pilots are eligible for what's called standby travel, where we just pay the tax on the ticket. And I think I don't think you'd be able to include a frequent flyer levy for pilots themselves, because obviously, if you're operating the flight, you're not contributing towards demand. And if you're repositioning at the end of a duty, then you want to get home and see your family, and it's probably not fair. But I think in terms of like staff travel benefits, that's an area that could certainly be looked at, because to encourage flying on during holiday and days off, it's not really essential. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the point about trains is interesting. I'm not sure that a frequent flyer levy by itself would tackle that, because what you also need is an affordable functioning train system that means that people can go on holiday to Spain or wherever, and that they can afford to do that. So I think that alongside measures to reduce demand, you also need investment in trains to make sure that you're not just charging people more for flights, you're also making sure that they still have access to travel and can still stay mobile. Yeah, there's also been some discussion, I think, on ending frequent flyer reward schemes and kind of giving people incentives to fly. I think one of the, I think was it Norway or Sweden did temporarily ban frequent flyer schemes. So that's showing that it is something that can be done, although that wasn't I don't think, out of climate concerns. It was because of concerns around competition. But yeah, I think there's kind of like lots of things that need to be addressed to tackle this, and a frequent flyer levy is one of the measures.
Great, thanks. I can see a few stars popping up in the chat. So if people have any questions about what Ali or I have said so far, we'll take a few questions now. So let's go to Finley first, and then Larry.
Okay, I was just going to add to, I think, in terms of the train question, there's a couple of things with the frequent flyer levy. Having read the report, it's sort of like it will stop domestic travel as well if that's included, because people won't want to waste, if they have a certain number of air miles frequent flights they can take, if they waste those traveling in the UK or domestically, when they'll then run out of credits to use internationally. And the kerosene tax will definitely, part of the reason why it's cheaper to fly than take the train within the UK could be because the kerosene's tax-free. And if that tax was applied, the plane would be relatively more expensive compared to the train. And then you could use some of that taxation to fund better train services. So it's kind of like a virtuous cycle if that's the way the policy is implemented. And then all I was going to say was my perspective, having worked for an engine manufacturer, is sort of long haul, large engines were really suffering. Medium haul, sort of Ryanair, EasyJet are doing a little bit better, but yeah, the business jet ones were still seeing quite high engine flying hours. So that agrees with what you're saying, and it certainly feels like just a perspective on that, I think, is quite interesting. If you look at how ground transport's being electrified and decarbonised. Sort of Tesla are leading the way, but they're making a real, in order to fund the development of technology. So the kind of millionaires that were first buying their cars because it was out of the reach of lower income families, but through getting them to pay for it, it's becoming more democratized, and you'll probably soon see Tesla cars that are a lot cheaper. And it's definitely a strategy that could be taken here, with definitely making the very rich and the very wealthy force them to use the cutting edge technology that's more effective. So yeah.
And obviously the emissions footprint from a flight in a private jet is much larger than even a first class ticket.
Yeah. And Larry, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how the rate structure, whether it's a frequent flyer levy or a air mileage one, might change over time, presumably becoming more expensive. And I think along those lines, it might also be worthwhile thinking about changing over time the definition of what frequent means, or the similar implication of distance, so that, right now the talk is that one flight per year wouldn't have any levy on it. But maybe we should be thinking in the longer term about, one flight every 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years is what the expectation should be. Otherwise, people think it's an entitlement to fly more frequently than they are now. A lot of them, you only have, I think in the UK, maybe half of people flying in a year. But the people that aren't flying say, well, I'm entitled to fly once a year. So you see an uptick there in that segment of the population, perhaps. So I think maybe look at changing definitions and rate structures over time. That's just a question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the proposal is kind of a balance between addressing the harms caused by aviation and being something that's kind of politically palatable, because the ideal amount that people fly is none. Like, it's a really it's a really high emitting activity. It's it produces more emissions in a short period of time than pretty much anything else that people can do, but it's not like a politically viable proposal that the government is going to accept, to be like, people have to stop flying. So it's kind of attempting to balance the need to make significant reductions in the amount that people fly, while also not telling people who go on holiday, once a year or every other year, that they can't do that anymore. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we need to imply that there's like a safe, or that implying that there's like a safe level of aviation is really problematic. And also that if we're saying to people in wealthy countries like the UK with high levels of flying, okay, it's fine, fly once a year, then what do we say to all the people in developing countries who would also like to fly once per year? Are we just saying, well, we're going to maintain those inequalities, and we're going to keep on having these kind of like global systems where some people get to emit more than others? Because that's also completely unfair. So yeah, I definitely agree that that's an issue.
Great.
Wendy's also got a question.
Yeah, can we go? Go Wendy.
Seems like the only fair thing would be for there to be an individual carbon budget. Like, you can only use so much. But as a person who lives in a rural area, sometimes you've got to have a car because there's no other way of getting about. But my question's re the levy. Is this a government tax? Is the government going to be collecting this money? And if so, can it collect from these private jets and things? And then what about things like helicopters that take people out to oil rigs all the time? And that's pretty often. Would there be exemptions for people like the air ambulance system, which we use a lot here in the Cumbrian Fells, where people have had accidents? So lots of little things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone would propose taxing air ambulances. I mean, that seems to me to be a very acceptable use of the limited carbon budget for aviation. Coming back to the transport system and the need for good low carbon public transport. Yeah, absolutely. and that's something that, you know, that needs to be in place alongside taxing aviation. You know, I was in correspondence with a possible supporter who was saying that they live in a remote area and that they need to, on an island, I think, and that they need to take a plane when they go to medical appointments. So clearly somebody should not be taxed for traveling to medical appointments. But again, that's the kind of flight, like, you know, low numbers of people and short haul, which is relatively easy to decarbonize and start using electric planes for. And sorry, Wendy, I think you had another bit of your question, which is a bit I haven't answered.
Helicopters and private jets, are they taxable too?
So I think, you know, entirely in favour of putting very high taxes on private jets, but also that our position on that is that the only private jets permitted to land in the UK should be electric jets, that we should just say no to fossil fuel private jets, because again, usually short distances and low number of passengers, and, you know, a prime opportunity for investment by very wealthy individuals in an emerging technology. I don't think we've got a position on helicopters which are being used for the same purpose as private jets, so by wealthy individuals rather than for, you know, essential ambulances. But I'd have thought our position would be the same, that that kind of journey should also not be done by fossil fuels. It should be electric only.
Great, thanks very much. Some great questions. I think the just a couple of things that have occurred to me just through this is one is I think there's some very justified sort of questioning of what impact this has on you know, do the people who are allowed one flight then start flying more? And I think it's to an extent an unknown. There has been, I think the New Economics Foundation did carry out some economic modelling of the frequent flyer levy, and their modelling showed that it kind of wouldn't have that effect, that it broadly would reduce demand. But, you know, the models and well, as they say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So, you know, it's not sort of, we can't be sure, but the indication is that it would sort of achieve to some degree, to a quite strong degree, according to their model, the goals that we want. But that's definitely a very valid concern. We need to think about that. And particularly, I think in terms of Larry's question of whether it escalates, I think there's equally a perfectly imaginable scenario where you give people a declining budget and equally people race to use it while they can. And, you know, given that they've now got a deadline. But again, would people, we don't know, it's, you know, but it's worth exploring. And I think Ali mentioned air miles and the kind of bonuses people get for flying frequently as it is. And it's made me realize there's a big public relations, big kind of jump we've got to make or move in the minds of the public from rewarding people, airlines rewarding people for flying more frequently, to get from there to somewhere where we're taxing people for flying more frequently. You know, it's not just about, we're going kind of from a positive reinforcement through the neutral kind of, we're not telling you to do one or the other, to a negative, stop doing it. And actually, you realize actually we've got quite a shift to make in people's minds in terms of what the system is sort of encouraging people to do. So I think we do need to bear that in mind. But you know, equally things have to change fairly quickly. That's the nature of the science that we know of. And one final one, I didn't know how it might work, but there's sort of one flight a year and then people talking about trains or boats. I wonder whether we could, slightly blue sky idea of whether or not you could have a minimum budget that you can fly with, or whether you could somehow trade that for like money off your boat fare or train fare, and kind of have to give people a kind of like pay for this or get free money for that for traveling more sustainably. I don't know how that would work, or whether you just sort of hypothecate, I think is the word, the tax from the air miles levy, and then, as people mentioned, subsidize other things. But I guess consciously linking that and saying you can either take one flight or get a cheaper trip to, you know, by train or whatever, might kind of also encourage people to think differently.
Another question from Larry.
Larry, let's go to that, and then we're sort of open to some questions, some more general discussion questions. Larry. You're muted.
There we go. I'm just curious how this fits in with the concept of climate emergency. and the time deadlines that different organizations or people think are appropriate. So, for example, on one extreme, you've got Extinction Rebellion saying that we should be carbon zero in 5 years. You know, they're saying 2025 or a year later now, so maybe it's 2026. You've got other people saying, a decade, 2030. Kevin Anderson saying for the wealthy northern nations, due to the equity principles of the Paris Agreement, we should be looking at 2035 to 2040 for being zero carbon. So how does the levy approach fit in with that kind of thinking?
Yeah, so obviously I'm, in favour of having more ambitious climate targets, more quickly. And the idea of the frequent flyer levy isn't that by itself it could reduce aviation emissions by the amount needed to fit within, the need to cut carbon emissions, really, really substantially within the next decade or so. It's more that it has to be included among the policy measures that are in place, because it's the only one which will have a redistributive element. And that if you bring in measures to cut flying without having that kind of like progressive or incremental tax, then it's going to affect poorer people more than wealthier people. But absolutely, I would agree with, the argument that you do need hard limits on demand, and you need other measures to be in place as well to ensure that demand is reduced enough. But within that, there needs to be something like the frequent flyer levy or the air miles levy to make the impacts progressive rather than regressive.
Great, thanks. So we've got about sort of half an hour to go, and I'm keen to get onto the sort of other discussion topics. But Wendy and Finley, if you could ask your questions, maybe just one then the other, and we'll come back to them just in sort of one sentence, if that's possible. And then we'll get on to these discussion topics.
If it's possible to ring fence the money gathered with the levy, what would the most important thing be to spend that money on?
So as people probably know, the government doesn't actually hypothecate. So it doesn't, apart from, I think there's one specific tax around the NHS where it does, but it doesn't actually like being like, well, we'll take tax from this and we'll spend it on this. And I think but if it were to do that, I think there's a couple of things that would be good to think about. And we've already talked about how that tax could go towards funding lower carbon alternatives to flying. And the other thing we've been thinking about is whether that could be used to support people working in the industry to retrain to go into lower carbon sectors. But in a way, it's sort of a bit like, yeah, it's quite a hypothetical question. But I'm sure we could all think of lots of great things that could be spent on. And just one more thing on that, the difficulty, it's quite hard to model that, particularly because at the moment nobody really knows what aviation demand is going to look like over the next couple of years as the world comes out of COVID.
Yeah, my question, trying to be quick with it, is you mentioned £200 carbon price from the UK government for 2050. I was just wondering, do you have like a source for that, and do they have a view of how they think that's going to ramp up with time? And that's just leading into a point I'd make to some of the questions were made earlier when people talk about it needs to happen faster. So, and people doing one flight a year, it's important to think absolutely for the climate crisis, we need to limit use of fossil fuel, so we need to make it expensive to burn it. And if we do that across the board equally, then you start to really hard hit even low income families that just need to drive to work. So once you've applied that, and we do need to apply that increasing price that will make flights more expensive with time, the frequent flyer levy is on top of that to then take some money away from the really rich high emitters and help minimize the impact to low income families.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a measure to kind of redistribute the remaining flights more fairly and ensure that the people affected by limiting demand aren't just the poorest people who fly less often while the richest carry on. And I'm sure it can certainly be argued as well that the frequent flyer levy by itself isn't enough to do that, because we have a hugely unequal society with huge gaps between rich and poor, and there's certainly an argument that you need a lot of measures to address that, particularly in the context of increasing limits on emissions. And I will try to find the source for that 200 for the carbon price, and I'll put it in the chat.
Great, thanks. Great questions. Let's just so now what I want to sort of ask people is their thoughts on, given we've talked a lot about, I'm sure we're all living through coronavirus, and it has had an enormous effect, particularly on aviation, with people not traveling or traveling substantially less. There's also been some knock-on effects in terms of as the industry has then tried to reduce its sort of become cash positive and reduce its spending. There's been some big knock-on effects for workers in the industry, with people having their contracts, some airlines and airports reviewing and changing contracts or just laying people off. So in that context, which we're sort of living through still, we just wanted to kind of, we're rather proposing an additional tax. Alongside that, some airlines have been calling for, certainly in the UK, for a suspension of air passenger duty, the one sort of tax that there is on aviation in the UK. Whereas, what we're talking about here is an additional tax or a replacement to air passenger duty, but we're also suggesting that is one of a collection of taxes or measures. So we just wanted to open the floor and ask, how do people feel about, what's it like, how can we tackle and talk about a frequent flyer levy at the moment in the context of coronavirus? Is it easy? Do people feel like it's easier to talk about because there's reduced demand, and actually the airlines kind of at a point of rethinking and reshaping, and actually more a new agenda from government and a new direction is easier? Or actually is it the fact that the industry is struggling, does that make it harder to talk about it? So yeah, it'd just be really interesting to kind of see how people feel about it. If you've thought about it at all, put a star in the chat, and it'd be great to sort of hear some different views from different countries, different parts of the world where we all are. If anyone's got any thoughts about it might be in your local area, how in that context of sort of limited flights.
I can go quickly if there isn't one from other people. I was just thinking, in the wrong context, you can think it's not a good time to introduce a tax. But if you think about it set the argument up that actually most people are worried about their jobs, and at the moment, just across the economy, and how are we going to pay off this debt we've been building up the past year and stagnating. People are really worried about just being completely unemployed, let alone the price of a flight to go on holiday next year being more expensive. So when you say, right, we need to get money to rebuild our economy, keep lots of the local jobs going, and you see all these millionaires flying on private jets, it's like an obvious, there are people that have all benefited actually from the crisis, probably increased their money. So it's a great way of actually raising revenue from those people to help out with this recovery. And I think that's the way to phrase the argument. It's all about how can we revitalize the economy locally for lower income people.
That's really interesting. And do you think that would, because I mean, there's one thing we assume, I think we'd probably all make the assumption that the industry as a whole, like certainly the executives, would be very opposed to this kind of tax, any kind of tax probably. But do you think that kind of framing around redistribution, around funding, as you say, addressing national debt, but also just funding a recovery, do you think that kind of framing is likely to be to kind of be, or could be communicated well to people like yourselves who are part of the industry or who were part of the industry but aren't sort of not the executives running the company? Do you think that would kind of, do you think what is that going to be frictious? Is there going to be friction and resistance, or could that be framed quite well?
So obviously the people it doesn't work well to is the aviation industry, but all other industries, if you think about people that are losing their jobs in the arts and entertainment industries, in local shops that are closing, and the government needs to raise money to fund local projects to boost the economy, it's targeting them. It's a more difficult one for the aviation industry but you need to talk about the realities of that. Like at the moment, the economy is suffering, and working class people are suffering the most. So it doesn't make sense to give tax cuts to a sector that's there to really benefit the richest in society at this point in time. So it's obviously not going to be good for jobs in the aviation industry, but it's about making people that are in that industry be realistic about what's required at this point. So there's a different argument I think you need to make for people outside of the industry and people inside.
It's potentially a bit more, understandably more delicate and a different sort of, because again, it's quite something when you, especially with the executives positioning themselves calling for tax cuts, again, it's then a big jump to say actually we should be hiking tax and increasing it. Again, that could be seen as quite confrontational.
I think the other thing you can do is sort of say, well, we will use that money to help people that have been let go by the industry, and that would help. Larry's got a question next if we want to go to him.
Go, Larry.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. On what Finley was just saying. If we were to argue it that way, if I were the airline industry, I think what I would do is say, well, we need to ring fence that and make it possible for those who aren't able to fly because of economic losses during COVID, help them and help the industry. So that kind of argument could potentially backfire.
Mike has a bit of a detailed comment. I get what you're saying there. Do you want to say anything over voice to just emphasize that?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yeah. Just to expand on my comment, really, it seems to me that like so many of these proposals for decarbonising the economy, the real problem isn't with people in general, because I think people have shown themselves, even during this COVID period, to be quite flexible and adaptable. We will accept quite radical and quite rapid changes to our social organisation, provided everyone feels like they're in it together, everyone's sharing in the burden of it. It seems to me that the crucial question is always where are the real blocks, and the real blocks to me seem always to be the people with vested interests in making money out of flying, out of whatever it is that keep perpetuating and so on. So I don't worry too much about how we're going to change people's minds in the general sense. My worry is, how do we deal with all the opposition that will come from those vested interests, and the way that is articulated through the media and the power that those media barons have to articulate those arguments against it. That's all.
Great. No, thanks. That's a really great addition. I think Wendy, I can see you've got is that recent? Just put your hand up. I think we go to that, and then just going to jump onto another kind of try and look at some more local situations and turn the conversation on. So, Wendy.
Yeah, the people I find hardest to talk to, well, the only people I do sort of know, are those that have got family abroad. So I know a few sort of like mixed English Spanish families, and they fly over every summer, every Christmas. Or people who've got sons and daughters having babies in Australia and feel that they need to go each time a new baby's born. And whenever I talk to them about taking the no-fly pledge, oh, but I've got family there. Well, I had a son in Australia for 7 years, but so what? People make those decisions. But I'm always amazed at how many people, like when my parents were in a care home and most of the staff were either Filipino or Indian or whatever, and they all managed to go back home for a month every year. And I'm amazed that people on those wages manage that. but they do feel that if they've got family abroad or they are from abroad, they have an entitlement. And it's really hard. They get very emotional and very angry when you try to sort of suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And you know, there's an easier argument to make to people around flying to visit family in Spain or other countries in Europe than there is in Australia, because you know that's a journey that could and should be done by train. But I think as well, if you look at the flights that people actually are taking, they tend not, you know, things like going to see your grandchild or whatever, you know, that's something that matters a lot to people. But if you look at the flights that people are actually taking, most of them aren't for that kind of, you know, that very deep emotional reason that people don't want to give up. And you know, there was a study of a group of frequent flyers which found that they rated half of the flights that they were taking as unimportant. So, you know, there's huge potential to cut down a very significant chunk of flights even before you get into the flights that people do think are important and are really, really deeply attached to. But I think that, you know, also people, you know, for the minority of people who are frequently doing long haul flights, like that's just not a viable way to live in a world with incredibly tight carbon budgets. And you know, obviously if people can't see their families as often, then that's, you know, really, really sad. But the climate crisis is already having an incredibly severe impact on people around the world who will never, ever be able to afford to get on a plane, people who can't feed their kids because of changing rainfall patterns. And it's just not a viable situation to allow that to continue. But it is an incredibly difficult conversation to have with people, definitely, and something that people, you know, can have a really, you know, understandably emotional response to.
Great. Finley, I know you had another question, but I'm keen to sort of move on and chat to.
Ali's covered most of it anyway, so let's go on.
Great, fantastic. I want the final topic that we want to kind of explore and really kind of try and gather some views on is a lot of the work on the frequent flyer levy has been in the UK and therefore been quite UK focused. There are, I know that Possible is sort of working on some stuff to try and get more of the statistic that 15% of people take 70% of flights is for the UK, but it's very likely to be very similar across in other countries, other parts of the world. So the Possible are, I know, working on some work to get those numbers and try and find that data from other countries, because that is a crucial argument. Obviously, it's making that inequality argument and having evidence to prove it. Along with that data, we also then obviously want to discuss how we might kind of go about taking the frequent flyer levy to other countries. So I think in a few minutes we're going to break into just a really brief kind of breakout room session in sort of just groups of 4 and come back with kind of just think about what might be the key thing that you'd need in your country, or you know, between the 4 each of you contribute to kind of do that in each of the countries that you guys are in, or the area. But I was wondering whether before that, Con, you might, I know you've got some numbers and work on frequent flyer levy. Would you be willing to share a couple of slides on the stuff you've been doing?
Yeah,
just 2 minutes sort of. Yeah,
great. Yeah, sure. I just made 3 slides, so I'm going to try to share this. Not sure if people can see this now. Yep. So what we did is we commissioned a study because next year there are elections in the Netherlands, and we wanted to put in some points for the discussions in the elections. And one of the issues, apart from agriculture and housing, is transport. And within that, we had a whole package being looked at by a consultancy. And part of that package is a frequent flyer charge. This is the press release that we made afterwards. It's in Dutch, but if you take something like DeepL translator, or if you like Google, then there is a fairly good translation available. What we did is we asked the researchers to look at the concept, and our aim was not to make a very perfect study, but we just wanted to bring the concept into the discussion so that we see that also this just transition is being dealt with. For us, this is one of the key issues that we are working on, that the polluter pays and that all the people can join the transition. And then what we asked them to do is to look at a frequent flyer tax that taxes the first flight with 40 euros, the second flight a year with 80, and the third 160, and the fourth and next 320 euros. So if you then look at the percentage of people who are flying, then last year 42% in the Netherlands did not fly, and another 21% flew, and then 2% of the population flies more than 8 times a year. And the motive is that for 78% of the people asked, what was the motive for your last flight? They said holidays, 13% friends and family, and 7% business. So that's not per se the amount, the percentage of flights, but it's what the people asked, replied when asked what was the motive of your last flight. So the result is that in the Netherlands, in the top part of the table on the right hand side, it says what the income is of the tax, and then you can see the distribution of the taxes over the different numbers of flights that people have made, and you can see that the majority of the income is above 3 flights a year. And then for the last part, the effects in the Netherlands, we have a total of 25 megaton CO2 emissions equivalent a year, assuming that there is a factor 2 for high flight emissions. We wanted to take the lower end of the estimations, and then the reduction because of this type of tax, frequent flyer tax, is 4 megaton. So that's the result of the study that we did.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, so building on that, we're just going to jump into some smaller groups quickly, just for like 5 minutes. Just chat about what it might be like trying to kind of campaign on this or make that argument in your region or country, and obviously there'll be people in your group from different places, so we'll all sort of exchange that. And the question that, the sort of question that I'll just put it in the chat as well, is just to bring back to this group collectively, is what is the one thing you would need in your region or country, or the one kind of big barrier? Maybe it's just a barrier that's is a problem, but what is the one thing that you'd want to change, need to have, or you'd want to overcome to campaigning on the frequent flyer levy in your country? So it's going to be 5 minutes, then we'll come back, we'll share what we've come up with really briefly, and then we'll kind of close at that point. Okay. Options. I know. After closing, yeah, cool. After. Great, okay. So you'll have to click accept to join the room.
on a really Eurocentric perspective, in my opinion. What is happening right now in Costa Rica, for example, in relation to the coronavirus is really interesting because Costa Rica has always promoted itself as a green destination, but we have a clear dependency on mass tourism. So the country tried to tackle the pandemic by early days in March, establishing a quarantine, and then they opened borders requiring a coronavirus test. And now all this is gone because we need tourists. So there's no quarantine, there's no test, and they're even cutting the jet fuel taxes that we used to have in order to seduce airlines to come back and bring tourists to Costa Rica. So when we think about that, like if we are going to propose a new tax for frequent flyers, when countries are doing exactly the opposite in the global south, the conversation is over because it's not going to happen. Like you need tourists to have employment in the local population. That's one thing that I see problematic. And then the other thing is like, I said that the discussion is extremely Eurocentric, and I think it is in terms of infrastructure also, because if you try to think from the context of people like Brazil or India, when there is, we could say that Brazil, there's not a huge railroad network, but there's a lot of services of relatively good buses that move people around, but air transport is key for moving a lot of people around in Brazil because there's no alternative. Same in India, when you are faced like a train ride that is like 12, 16 hours instead of flying 1 hour, then some segment of the population decide to travel by air because it is faster, because it's relatively a little bit cheaper, but I don't really think it's an argument. But also like right now in the context of coronavirus, like if you are going to expose yourself to a train full of crowded people in India, or instead taking a flight with 45 people, I see people would prefer to fly instead of getting into a train that has not the conditions of European trains in terms of healthiness, infrastructure, etc. Even just waiting at the train station in India, it is really different than waiting at a train station in London. So I think that that's one of the things that I'm concerned. And then to close, there's also like the regional global dimension of all this. So yes, we can magically dream that we could achieve a tax for frequent flyers in let's say France. Okay, we got the France tax, but then this will not stop people to take the train to Germany and fly from Germany. But even if we manage to get a tax from the whole European area, well, now UK is not part of the European area, so people could fly from the UK and not be submitted to the taxes. And then also like Turkey, like people could just fly from Turkey and then just circumvent the legislation, because that's the problem with global aviation. It is global. So if I saw a news recently that the European Commission is asking the bank to stop funding airport expansions. We could say that this is a good step, but
Alex, sorry to interrupt. I'm just worried we've only got 30 seconds left, and it'd be good.
If you block airport expansions in Europe, it does not stop airport expansion in Turkey or in Saudi Arabia. So these people will see it as an opportunity, and they will expand because Europe is not expanding. So that's the questions.
Yeah. Paolo, do you have any quick thoughts in 10 seconds?
I don't think in 10 seconds it's possible.
Sorry, it took all the time.
In fact, we have 60 seconds before it. We've got a countdown. You've got a minute.
Okay, a minute. Okay, the first thought. We have different situations here in Portugal. We have flights to our islands, Azores and Madeira. And for that, there are, of course, rich people that are always flying, and people from enterprises, they don't care about the money. So it's to put more prices, it's indifferent. And there is a lot of people that are flying because of wealth motives, for example. We have another big idea. We have like a bridge, aerial bridge between Porto and Lisbon, with airplanes all hours. Even if they are completely full or empty, it's always going on.
Right.
Also, between
Oh, sorry, Paolo, you got cut off there. Great. Sorry, that did feel quite short in the end. Maybe it did for everyone else. Does anyone want to kind of feedback on what they said or what came up in their groups? Stick a star in the chat, or it'd be great to hear some you know, the one thing that people maybe. Bentley.
We were just midway through a discussion, got cut off. Bryce in my group was talking about sort of if one country does something, so let's say the UK implements a really progressive carbon tax. Internationally, though, you haven't done it, people like it will be an issue because people might avoid the UK and just start flying to France instead, where the fuel price is cheap. I hadn't quite responded to that, but I was going to say something along the lines of that definitely is important. We do need to get international agreement. It will be difficult to get it all at once, though, particularly if the US is blocking things, Poland, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. So there definitely needs to be, I think, a goal of international agreement, but some countries taking the lead and more likely agreeing bilateral agreements like the EU and China, or within the EU first, and then try and get as many people in to approach that international. And when there's a few outliers, it'll be easier to force them to do something. So I think it's right that international agreement is the end goal, but it should also be understood that it's going to be really difficult to get that, and we need to move faster. And a lot of fossil fuel companies are talking about the need for an international agreement because they know that's so far away and really unpolitically viable, because there will be some countries that oppose it. And that's what the aviation industry is talking about. They're talking about CORSIA because it's been agreed globally. But you can see a global agreement is really weak. So we do need stronger unilateral, multilateral, like bilateral agreements first.
Yeah, that's a good point. Bram, what was your one thing or the thing that came up in your chat?
Well, not really one thing, but in general, I think that some organizations need more information on how to implement the frequent flyer levy in their specific country, because not all the data that support us have been made available in their countries. And also, we had the discussion about the difference between, for instance, the Netherlands, which has a very well-connected railway system with other capitals in the area, whereas Portugal is somewhat more eccentric and probably has a good connection to Madrid, but not to the rest of, and it's also shaky. And that would probably make it less acceptable to the public, because you can't point to the alternatives that are already there. So that would make a difference. On the other hand, the leakage you got, that's also been mentioned before, that people would run to other countries to dodge the frequent flyer tax. It's something that does hamper some of the effectivity, but still, even the Netherlands, which you're very easily in Brussels or Frankfurt with train, and then you could dodge the tax. And even with that situation, if the Netherlands was the only country who would have a frequent flyer levy, it would halve the effect, but still half of the effect would still happen. So it's still worthwhile to implement the policy.
Great, yeah, that's interesting. Leakage is definitely something that people worry about. I've been interested, Ton, you've expressed in the chat that you don't think it would. Do you have in a couple of sentences, can you summarize what your counter argument?
Well, if you add 40 euros for the first flight, as we did, then to avoid that levy, you need to go to Brussels or to Frankfurt, and the train trip to there is more than 80 euros. And the same holds true if you take a car. Apart from the money, it's also the time. So I think that the argument is always being used by the industry, but I don't think that there is any really, I'm not afraid of it. Even if you think about the UK, you know, how much time and effort and money does it cost to go to France to take a flight?
Great, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that comes up, though. People, that's the constant sort of, and that's in line, I guess, with the sort of dominant economics that we live with, which is that, you know, you have to make it cheaper than the next person, otherwise people go elsewhere. It's definitely something we need to have a clear, you know, clearly integrate and a clear response to, and clearly a regional or global agreement is ideal, but more difficult than doing things in one country. I think we're getting sort of towards the end. If anyone, I hope everyone sort of enjoyed and got a lot from it. I think that if there's anyone else who's got something that they wanted to feedback from their group, probably got time for another one. If there's anyone burning up with the thing that they want, or the thing that's stopping them campaign on a frequent flyer levy in their region or country. But seeing nothing, I think we'll sort of wrap it up. We've sort of recorded this, so it'll be available later, so you can come back and rewatch the presentations. We'll also share the slides, and yeah, I think thanks so much to everyone for joining. And as I say, I think there's more. There's potential. I think there is this work that Possible's doing on trying to explore other countries' data. Is something that will find data from other countries around who flies. I think is ongoing. So keep an eye out for when that's ready and produced and out, because that hopefully will allow people to kind of make this argument more strongly in different places, in other parts of the world. And yeah, Ali's put her email in the chat, so feel free to drop her an email. Yeah, thanks very much for everyone. Thanks Ali for presenting. Thanks Finley for your sort of tech support as well. It's been really interesting, really fantastic kind of range of views from admittedly a relatively Eurocentric discussion, but partly I guess that's also, in this case at least, where a lot of the frequent flying is. I mean, certainly in the global north. But yeah, a good point nonetheless that Alex was making. That yeah, it was very Eurocentric. But yeah, thanks very much, and yeah, see you again at something soon at the rest of the weekend if you're here for the network meeting.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Well, thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Thanks.